October 26, 1943. 3,000 feet over a searing blue of Pacific sky 15 miles off Bougainville. The air tastes of salt and hot metal. Below, the green of jungle breaks into a thin line of black reef and foaming surf. In the cramped cockpit of an FM-2 Wildcat, Lieutenant J.G. Daniel Danny Hayes of Composite Squadron VC-9 tightened his helmet strap and listened to the restless click of his oxygen regulator. Sweat beaded along his brow despite the cool rush of wine through the slipstream. Around him, 8 silver and olive fighters fanned in a loose combat spread, the small stubby wings of the FM-2 cutting the sunlight into harsh slashes of glare on painted cowling. The radio crackled with the carrier's voice through static, terse, efficient. Saratoga fighters report. Bogies bearing 210, range 50. The words were white noise and command, the language of survival. Hayes thumbed the throttle and felt the little Boeing, built under license by General Motors Eastern Aircraft Division, answer with a characteristically blunt, mechanical bark. The FM-2 was smaller and lighter than the earlier Grumman Wildcats, its fuselage reinforced for carrier operations and its Wright R1820 engine tuned for quick torque. Pilots joked that the plane looked like a stout little barn swallow, but that joke had teeth. Its armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks and rugged landing gear meant it came home when many other planes didn't. Below them, 2 dark specks grew, Japanese A6M0s, the island's notorious hunters, climbing with the silky grace and lethal economy of the Mitsubishi design. They were sleek, seductive in their simplicity, long, frail-looking noses, no armor, light construction, deadly maneuverability. On the radio a voice from a different network drifted up, intercepted chatter, the clipped tones of a Japanese pilot mocking in a language Hayes only half understood. Small birds, the translation later read in reports, playthings. The men in the Zeros saw the FM-2s and laughed at the stubby Americans who would try to tangle with them. Hayes tasted the old story in his mouth, outmaneuvered, outclimbed, outgunned, that had been the conventional wisdom for months. The Japanese Zero tore apart opponents who attempted close-turning fights. Yet the FM-2 pilots had a different lesson carved into the skin of their planes and the bones of their tactics. They had learned to fight not like spiders but like hunters. Disciplined, positional, and unromantically practical. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bob Carter, leading the division, tapped for altitude and clipped the radio. No head-on duels. Keep speed. Use cover. If they try to dance, we'll punish the bounce. His voice was low and measured, a leader who'd watched young pilots vanish into the blue and had decided the only moral command was precise, cold instruction. The FM-2s broke into pairs, the formation tightening into the practiced geometry of an escort unit that had learned to treat each other's wings as the only sure thing between life and sea. The first contact was a shimmer on the horizon, 2 Zeros peeling into a lazy, deceptive climb, confident in their agility. Hayes watched the Japanese pilot's silhouette flare in the sun. From the cockpit he could see their thin frames hunched over stick grips, faces shadowed by goggles. The enemy dove, but not into the intimate, continuous turn the Zero excelled at. They were probing, testing for overcommitment. Hayes held his altitude, tacked into a shallow diving slice, and felt the FM-2's airframe resist compression with a satisfying staccato cough. He kept his sight picture and allowed distance to become the ally it had to be. As the first bursts crossed the thin air, the FM-2s did what the Zeros expected them to avoid. They did not try to outturn. They traded geometry for energy. Hayes pushed the throttle harder, and the Wildcat lunged forward in a stiff, purposeful bob. The enemy, expecting a tangled dogfight that favored their light design, blinked at the sudden, unapologetic aggression. Hayes' wingman, Ensign Tom Morales, dove in a slanted boom and zoom that let his .50 caliber Brownings speak in short, devastating sentences. For every tight, elegant turn the Zero could draw, the Wildcat had armor to take a hit and enough mass behind a burst to make it count. The first Zero caught Tracer. The pilot, likely young and overconfident, hunched as fire raked an engine cowling. His machine shuddered, smoke spitting, and then flame curled along a wing. He tried to roll. The Zero's reflexes were immediate, but the Wildcat's tactic had already broken the pattern. In a blink, the Japanese fighter folded inward and fell away, a black stain against the sea-silver horizon. The FM-2s did not gloat. They kept disciplined spacing. They cut off retreat vectors and herded the enemy into angles where the Wildcat's strengths, survivable structure, heavier armament, and the deliberate use of vertical space, could be leveraged. Below them, the carrier's deck crew watched from the island as a black dot grew smaller, then detonated in a scatter of smoke. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander William Bill Harper, tied into the fight's nervousness, allowed himself a brief nod. The dispatches that crossed his desk would later call it a single kill, an unimpressive tally among many, but for the men in those cramped cockpits it was a checkpoint, proof that technique, training, and an aircraft built to take punishment could rewrite expectations. There was a taste in the air beyond petrol and adrenaline. Disbelief. The Japanese pilots had mocked the FM-2 as a tiny thing, a plane meant only for the awkward work of escorting slow convoys. That smugness was cracking now, hairline fractures of doubt spreading through radio nets. The Wildcats kept coming, organized and blunt, and every skittish Zero that tried to test them paid a visible price. Hayes, voice hoarse from the tension, fed the climb and thought, not of mockery, but of the men who had welded armor plates, of the carrier crews who had practiced dead stops in the dark, and of the squadron maintainer who had said weeks ago, "These birds don't win you grace. They win you time." The dogfight would pulse on for minutes more. Contact, separation, a practiced weaving of wings that favored survival. By the time the formation tightened for return to the carrier, the FM-2s bore the faint silver scars of combat, paint flaked, an oil streak, a dented leading edge, and one confirmed kill to their names. The tiny fighter that had been mocked and intercepted chatter now returned to deck amid the low, private hum of men who had learned to trust a machine not for its glamour but for its blunt, stubborn usefulness. Spring 1943, Linden, New Jersey. The smell of hot metal, solvent, and machine oil hung thick in the air. Conveyor lines rattled as sheet aluminum skins met rivet guns in a percussion of labor and precision. This was not the glamorous factory floor of a famous aircraft company, it was Eastern Aircraft Division, a branch of General Motors, drafted into wartime duty. And here, far from the sleek facilities of Grumman's Long Island plant, America's unlikeliest fighter was being born. Rows of assembly workers, many of them women in denim overalls and kerchiefs, moved with practiced rhythm. They weren't building cars now. They were building something stranger, tougher. A compact fighter that looked almost cartoonish next to the long, elegant wings of a Spitfire or the menacing curves of a Zero. The FM-2 Wildcat, the newest and last version of a line that had already been declared obsolete, was being revived for a purpose that few outside the Navy truly understood. The FM-2 was not designed to dominate the skies in speed or maneuverability. It was designed to survive. Back in 1941, when the Japanese Zeros swept across the Pacific with astonishing agility and speed, the older F-4F Wildcats were outmatched on paper. Pilots called the Zero a ghost, lighter, faster, able to climb like smoke and turn like a thought. But the Wildcat even then carried a secret advantage. It could take a hit and keep flying. Where a Zero's fuel tank might explode from a single burst, the Wildcat's self-sealing fuel tanks would swell and close under pressure, choking fire before it spread. Its armor plating and reinforced cockpit could shrug off 7.7 mm bullets that would shred a Zero's unarmored fuselage. By 1943, Grumman had shifted its focus to the F-6F Hellcat, a newer, faster fighter. Yet the Navy still needed an aircraft small and rugged enough to operate from escort carriers, the smaller, slower baby flat tops that carried vital convoys across the Pacific. The massive Hellcats simply couldn't take off from their short decks. So General Motors stepped in to produce a lightweight Wildcat, optimized for carrier escort and convoy defense. The FM-2's design tweaks seemed minor but were transformative. Engineers replaced the older Pratt & Whitney engine with a more powerful Wright R1820-56 Cyclone, shedding unnecessary weight and improving climb performance. They trimmed the wingspan slightly, strengthened the tail assembly, and simplified the landing gear mechanism for easier maintenance. It was still slower than most frontline fighters, topping out around 320 miles per hour compared to the Zero's 350, but it could climb like a mule, turn tight enough to stay in the fight, and dive without fear of the wings tearing off. Most of all, it was honest. The FM-2 told its pilots exactly what it could and couldn't do. And for the men who flew off those tiny escort decks, that reliability was everything. Lieutenant Commander John T. Blackburn, a veteran pilot and later commanding officer of VC-33, described it best. The Wildcat wasn't fast and it wasn't fancy. But when you were coming back over black water, smoking, shot up and out of luck, that airplane would bring you home. Back on the factory floor, one engineer ran his hand over the plane's thick fuselage and muttered, "She looks like a bulldog." And that was it, the name stuck in squadron slang. The FM-2 was the bulldog of the Pacific, stubborn, heavy, and mean when cornered. Even as the first models rolled off the line, Japanese intelligence dismissed them as outdated designs recycled for convoy duty. Pilots of the Imperial Navy laughed over intercepted radio chatter, calling them ugly cubs and iron toys. To them the Zero was a samurai's blade, fast, light and honorable. The Wildcat was a club. But by the time the Wildcats reached the Solomons and the Gilberts, those clubs were breaking skulls. The combination of American industrial precision and evolving air tactics, like the Thach weave designed by Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach, allowed slower U.S. planes to coordinate in ways the Zeros couldn't match. Two Wildcats flying in interlocking defensive turns could cover each other's blind spots, turning the Zeros' agility into a liability. The Japanese pilots who mocked the Wildcats soon found themselves trapped in crossfire, their graceful turns becoming deadly spirals. In combat reports, phrases began to appear again and again: enemy disengaged, Zero driven off, Wildcat returned to base. For every slow, stubby fighter that landed battered and leaking, there was another that didn't land at all, a Zero that fell into the Pacific and vanished. The FM-2 was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be dependable. And in the brutal arithmetic of war, dependability was the difference between victory and extinction. November 20, 1943, Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The morning sun rose over a shattered horizon, painting the lagoon a deceptive gold. Below, the U.S. invasion fleet churned the turquoise water into foam, landing craft moving like insects toward the smoke-wrapped beaches. Above them, tiny silhouettes wheeled in formation, the FM-2 Wildcats of Composite Squadron VC-33, flying from the escort carrier USS Coral Sea, CV-57. It was the Wildcats' first real test in full-scale amphibious combat. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn adjusted the trim on his Wildcat, call sign White 1, scanning the rising haze. His voice crackled over the radio. "Keep your heads up, boys. The Japs will come out of the sun. They always do." From his altitude, Blackburn could see the tracers from the ships below, anti-aircraft bursts marking the edge of the Japanese defense. He knew that once the invasion began, the escort carriers, small, slow and thin-skinned, would become prime targets. Their only shield was the FM-2s. And sure enough, at 0917 hours the first warning came through the radar channel. "Bandits. 20+ incoming from the northwest, Angels 5. Zeros." The Japanese fighters approached in tight formation, silver wings flashing in the glare. They looked magnificent, fast, smooth, confident. Against them, the Wildcats appeared stubby and awkward, like mechanical turtles climbing toward death. But the pilots in those turtles were ready. The FM-2s split into two defensive sections, executing the Thach weave, that elegant, disciplined tactic of overlapping turns that turned weakness into strength. The first Japanese pair dove in from above, cannons blazing. Tracers sliced past Blackburn's canopy, tearing chunks of aluminum from his port wing. His Wildcat shuddered, but the armor held. He didn't flinch. "Stay tight," he barked. "Make him overshoot." As his wingman rolled opposite, the two Wildcats crisscrossed paths, and the Zero that had been chasing Blackburn found itself in the gun sight of the second American. 4 streams of .50 caliber fire stitched across its fuselage, tearing through its unarmored belly. The Zero erupted in flame, its pilot bailing too late, parachute never opening. Blackburn smiled grimly. "That's for mocking my ugly bird." But there was no time to celebrate. A second wave of Zeros came screaming in, diving steeply to exploit altitude advantage. One strafed the deck of the USS Coral Sea, bullets sparking across its flight deck. The carrier's gunners fired back, the noise rising to a chaotic roar. Ensign Jack Simmons, fresh out of training and flying his first combat patrol, pulled hard into a climbing spiral to intercept. The Zero behind him matched his move easily, the Japanese pilot grinning as his nimble machine slid into firing position. But Simmons had practiced the doctrine drilled into every Wildcat pilot: don't turn with a Zero. Dive and roll. He shoved the nose down. The Wildcat screamed as it dropped into a steep dive, the airframe shaking violently. The Zero followed, but at that speed, its fragile wings began to vibrate dangerously. Simmons waited, counting seconds, watching the altimeter spin. Then he pulled hard and the Wildcat, heavy but strong, held together. The Zero's wings didn't. A flash, a shudder, and the Japanese plane disintegrated, debris scattering across the water like silver confetti. Back on deck, mechanics and gunners craned their necks to watch the fight unfold in the sky. For the first time, the little FM-2 Wildcats, built in auto factories, flown by reservists and green pilots, were proving their worth. They weren't graceful, but they were relentless. In just 15 minutes of combat, VC-33 claimed 8 confirmed kills and lost only 1 aircraft, its pilot rescued from the sea. The Japanese raid failed to inflict any damage on the escort carriers. The next morning, as crews repaired bullet holes and refueled the Wildcats, one mechanic painted a small cartoon on the nose of Blackburn's fighter, a grinning bulldog biting a zero in half. The squadron loved it. When the combat reports reached Pearl Harbor, the analysts were stunned. The data was clear. Though outnumbered and slower, the FM-2s had achieved a kill ratio of nearly 8-1 in their first major engagement. The Japanese had entered the battle mocking the toy fighters defending the American convoys. They left it wondering how those toys had turned into predators. The FM-2 Wildcats legend, the bulldog that refused to die, had begun. December 1943, somewhere in the South Pacific. The sun was setting low over the Pacific horizon, turning the clouds to molten gold and blood-red streaks. On the deck of the USS Coral Sea CV-57, pilots gathered around a makeshift briefing board, a plywood slab nailed to a bulkhead, maps fluttering in the sea breeze. Lieutenant Commander John Thach himself, now a tactical training officer visiting the fleet, stood before them with a piece of chalk in hand. He drew two lines that met in an elegant crossing pattern. "This," he said, tapping the chalk, "is how a slower plane beats a faster one." The men leaned in, the sound of the waves and distant engines the only background noise. Thach's weave, the tactic that would define American carrier warfare, was simple in design but revolutionary in practice. Two aircraft, flying side by side, would crisscross paths continuously. If an enemy latched onto one Wildcat's tail, the other would turn across and fire at the attacker. Each protected the other, and the pattern could go on indefinitely like a lethal waltz in the sky. To the Japanese, who prized one-on-one dueling skill and fluid aerobatics, it was infuriating. The Zeros had no armor to withstand the Wildcats' .50 caliber bursts and no radio discipline to coordinate countermaneuvers. Once trapped in the weave, their only choice was to break off, or die. Thach turned from the board, wiping his hands on his flight suit. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "the days of fighting for glory are over. We fight to win, not to dance. Use your brains, not your pride." That philosophy spread like wildfire across carrier groups in the Pacific. On the USS Nassau CV-16, FM-2 pilots practiced the weave until it became muscle memory. On the USS Liscum Bay, training officers added another layer, the high side roll, a maneuver that exploited the Wildcat's stability to break vertical traps. The once derided escort squadrons, manned by part-time aviators and reservists, were becoming a disciplined machine, a fleet defense force built not on glamour but on grit. One of those reservists was Lieutenant J.G. Paul "Pappy" Renshaw, a former crop duster from Kansas. On patrol near Macon Island, Renshaw's section encountered 3 Zeros circling a damaged TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. The bomber was slow, losing altitude fast, smoke trailing from its right engine. Renshaw's wingman wanted to dive straight in, to save the Avenger with speed and courage. But Renshaw shook his head, his mind replaying the training lectures. "We don't charge samurai," he muttered. "We heard them." He split formation, forcing the Zeros to commit. The Japanese fighters dove on him instantly, eager to isolate the slow one. But as soon as they locked onto his tail, his wingman crossed in from the opposite direction, opening fire in a perfect weave. The lead Zero burst into flames before it could even roll away. The other two broke off in confusion, and Renshaw slipped under them to cover the Avenger's retreat. When they landed, the bomber's gunner, a 19-year-old from Wisconsin, limped across the deck and hugged Renshaw. "Didn't think anyone could save us," he said, grinning through oil-stained teeth. Renshaw just laughed. "Don't thank me, kid. Thank the weave." By early 1944, the Japanese had begun to realize something was changing. Reports from pilots described the American fighters as slow but omnipresent. The Wildcat, which once had to rely on individual skill to survive, was now part of a larger tactical web, one that exploited teamwork, radios, and radar coordination. Imperial commanders were baffled. "How do they do it?" one Japanese officer reportedly asked. "They are not better pilots, yet they do not die." The answer was in the discipline. Each FM-2 squadron was trained not to chase kills, but to protect each other and their fleet. They flew by the numbers, altitude, distance, bearing, keeping calm where the enemy relied on instinct. The result was devastating. In January 1944 alone, escort carriers using FM-2s shot down over 150 Japanese aircraft in defensive actions while losing fewer than 20 of their own. The Zero's dominance, once the terror of the Pacific, was eroding before the Americans' eyes. And with every new battle, Japanese pilots grew more desperate. They pushed their planes harder, dove deeper, and began taking suicidal risks. Meanwhile, the little Wildcats, battered, patched, and ugly, kept coming back. The Zero was fast. The Wildcat was smart. And in modern war, smart was starting to why. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The dawn light rose over an ocean that seemed endless, turning the waves into hammered steel. The sky was flawless, deceptively calm. But in the belly of the USS White Plains, CV-66, tension was electric. Mechanics worked by floodlight, tightening bolts, refueling and rearming rows of FM-2 Wildcats lined wingtip to wingtip along the narrow flight deck. Above them, the air group commander barked through a megaphone. "Gentlemen, today we stand between our fleet and the largest air strike Japan has ever launched. They want our carriers. They'll have to go through you first." It was the opening day of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese had assembled over 400 aircraft to crush the American invasion fleet near the Marianas Islands. It was to be their great comeback, the final strike of the once invincible Imperial Navy. But waiting for them were the Navy's new Hellcats and the escort carrier squadrons of humble, forgotten FM-2 Wildcats. On radar, the approaching Japanese formations appeared like a swarm of bees, hundreds of dots merging into a single pulsing mass. The Wildcats launched in waves, engines howling as they clawed into the humid morning air. From above, the Pacific was a sheet of light and shadow, and the first specks of enemy aircraft were already cutting through it. Lieutenant Dan Hayes, now a veteran with 6 kills to his name, adjusted his gun sight as his section climbed to intercept. His Wildcat shuddered in the turbulence, but the engine held strong. He looked down at his instruments, steady, and back up at the horizon where sunlight flashed on silver wings. Zeros. Dozens of them. They came in tight, beautiful formation, the signature of Japanese discipline in the air. But this time something was different. The Americans were already in position, guided by radar and radio, invisible eyes the Japanese couldn't yet match. "Angels 12, Hayes called. We've got bandits inbound. Form defensive weave, wait for the dive." The first wave of Zeros broke formation, screaming down toward the carrier task group. Anti-aircraft guns erupted in reply, the ocean turning into a storm of smoke and shrapnel. The Wildcats dove in behind them, engines roaring, wings trembling with recoil as .50 caliber fire cut across the sky. A Japanese pilot named Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka led one of the strike elements. He'd flown since the early days of the war, over Wake, over Guadalcanal, and had faced Wildcats before. He despised them. "American pigs," he once wrote in his diary. "They hide behind armor. They cannot fight like men." But as Tanaka dove toward a line of escort carriers, tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. He looked back, and saw 3 Wildcats, wings glittering, diving in perfect formation. He banked hard, expecting them to overshoot. Instead they broke apart, one climbing, 2 crossing under in the Thach weave. He pulled up. 1 Wildcat followed. He rolled left, the second was already there. For the first time, Tanaka realized something terrible. They weren't chasing him. They were trapping him. A burst of fire struck his right wing. Smoke filled his cockpit. The last thing he saw before bailing out was the stubby, grinning face of a Wildcat flashing past, its fuselage marked with the white star of the U.S. Navy. Back above the fleet, chaos turned into slaughter. The Japanese formations disintegrated under the coordinated defense. Wildcats and Hellcats tore through them with practiced precision, the result of 2 years of brutal training and tactical evolution. By noon, the air over the Philippine Sea was a graveyard of falling aircraft. Smoke trails and flaming wrecks dotted the water. American pilots began calling in their tallies: 2 down, 3 confirmed, splash another 0. From the bridge of the USS Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher watched the sky through binoculars. "They're breaking apart," he murmured. His operations officer grinned. "Sir, it's a turkey shoot." By nightfall, more than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, for the loss of fewer than 30 American planes. The once feared Zero had become a symbol of desperation, outmatched not just by technology, but by coordination, communication, and sheer survivability. When the Wildcats of the escort carriers returned, they came back riddled with holes. One missing an entire aileron, another trailing fuel. But they came back. As deck crews pulled the last of the damaged fighters into the hangar, a young crewman slapped the side of one battered FM-2 and said, "Ugly little bastard's tougher than she looks." The pilot, climbing down from the cockpit, grinned through soot and sweat. "That's why we keep winning," he said. "Because we don't need to be pretty to fight." The myth of the Zero's invincibility died that day over the Philippine Sea. And the small, stubby FM-2 Wildcat, the underdog of the Pacific, helped bury it. October 25, 1944, the Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Dawn broke red over the Samar Sea, and the waves reflected the rising sun like spilled blood. In the distance, a line of small American escort carriers, the Taffy 3 task unit, cut across the water, their decks stacked with FM-2 Wildcats and TBF Avengers. These were the smallest, slowest ships in the fleet, nicknamed Tin Can carriers. No one expected them to face Japan's full might. But fate had other plans. On that morning, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurida's powerful center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers, burst from the mist and steamed straight toward Taffy 3. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly defenseless. From the deck of the USS Gambier Bay, Commander Stanhope Ring stared at the horizon, his binoculars trembling in disbelief. "Battleships," he whispered. "They've got Yamato-class battleships." The alarm klaxons blared across the fleet. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. The Wildcats of VC-10, VC-65, and VC-3 roared to life, engines coughing, wings unfolding like armored wings of salvation. Lieutenant Robert Bob Copeland of the destroyer USS Samuel B. Roberts watched the first FM-2s take off as his ship turned to engage the enemy. "Those little Wildcats," he said, "were all we had between us and death." In the air, Lieutenant Thomas Tex Daves led his section toward the towering silhouettes of Kurida's fleet. Below, the sea was churning with shellfire, columns of water erupted where 18-inch shells from Yamato slammed into the waves. The Wildcats climbed hard, throttles wide open, engines screaming in protest. They carried almost no ammunition and no bombs. Their mission wasn't to win, it was to delay, distract, and confuse. "Make them think we're the whole damn fleet," Dave said over the radio. And so they did. Diving straight at the Japanese formation, the Wildcats charged in mock attack runs, machine guns blazing. They stitched tracer fire across the decks of cruisers and battleships, forcing Japanese gunners to duck for cover. Then they banked away, looped around, and did it again. To the Japanese observers below, it looked like a massive, coordinated strike. Kurita hesitated. His radar screens showed dozens of aircraft, and his men shouted conflicting reports: "Dive bombers incoming. Torpedo planes approaching." In truth, most of the Wildcats had already spent their ammo. But appearances mattered more than bullets. At the same time, TBF Avengers, also flying from the tiny escort carriers, dove in to launch torpedoes. The Wildcats followed, swooping in low to strafe the anti-aircraft gunners, shielding their slower comrades. "Keep him guessing, boys," Daves yelled. "If you run out of ammo, buzz their bridges, make 'em blink." And they did. Again and again. From the deck of the battleship Congo, Japanese officers watched in disbelief as one battered Wildcat screamed out of the sky, missing their command bridge by meters before vanishing into a cloud of smoke. The psychological effect was devastating. For nearly 3 hours, the small task group and its handful of Wildcats fought like demons. They had no reinforcements, no battleships, no armor, just determination and courage. At 9:20 a.m., the USS Gambier Bay was hit and began to sink. The sea swallowed her stern first, her deck still covered in smoke. But even as she slipped beneath the waves, Wildcats circled overhead, strafing enemy destroyers, buying time for survivors in the water. "Keep firing," Dave shouted over the radio. "If we go down, we go down swinging." By mid-morning, Kurita, confused, bloodied, and convinced he was facing a full carrier strike group, ordered his fleet to withdraw. The impossible had happened. Tiny escort carriers and their rugged Wildcats had turned back a Japanese battle fleet 10 times their size. When the smoke cleared, Taffy 3 was shattered, but alive. The air was thick with the stench of oil and cordite. Sailors clung to rafts, staring in disbelief at the retreating silhouettes of the Japanese warships. On the radio, a pilot's tired voice crackled through the static. "Tell the boys on deck, the Wildcats held." The legend of the FM-2 was sealed that day, not just as a fighter plane but as a symbol of defiance. Outgunned, outmatched, and underestimated, it had become the savior of men who had no right to survive. Even Japanese survivors of the battle later admitted, those small American planes, they fought like devils. Early 1945, the Pacific Front was closing in on Japan. Carrier decks buzzed with activity from F-6F Hellcats, F-4U Corsairs, and the newly introduced F-8F Bearcats, sleek, powerful machines that outperformed the old FM-2 in nearly every way. Yet, in the shadows of these legends, the Wildcat still flew, steady, reliable, unglamorous. Aboard escort carriers guarding the invasion fleets of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, hundreds of FM-2s sat lined up, their worn fuselages patched and repainted. They were the unsung guardians of convoys, protecting transports, bombers, and amphibious landings from last-ditch kamikaze raids. In one of those Wildcats sat Lieutenant Jack "Hawk" Preston, a pilot from Iowa who'd been flying since 1942. His plane was scarred with bullet holes and carried the faint ghost of its old squadron insignia, half burned off by engine heat. As he waited on deck, he watched the Corsairs launch first, faster, louder, more powerful. He didn't envy them. He just smiled. "Let the young bucks take the headlines," he said to his crew chief. "The old girl and I know how to get home." When the kamikazes came, they came in waves, desperate, chaotic, and deadly. Radar picked up inbound aircraft from Japan's southern islands, diving straight toward the American fleet. Preston's section of FM-2s launched immediately. The Wildcats climbed through turbulent air, the sea below dotted with flak bursts and tracer streams. Ahead, the sun glinted off aluminum, Zeros, Judas, and Kate's diving at suicidal speed. Preston's radio crackled, "Kamikazes inbound. Don't let them through." The Wildcats spread into pairs, instinctively falling into the same Thach weave that had saved them years earlier. It was second nature now, a dance of survival learned through countless battles. The old tactic still worked. A kamikaze dove toward a destroyer below. Preston dove after it, guns blazing. His .50 caliber rounds ripped through the Zero's tail, shearing it apart. The Japanese plane disintegrated in midair, scattering debris over the waves. Another Zero came for him, faster, nose blazing with cannon fire. Preston rolled left, pulling into a tight climb that forced his pursuer to overshoot. As the enemy flashed beneath him, Preston inverted and came down like a hammer, cutting loose a full burst that sent the Zero spiraling into the sea. His ammo counter hit 0. His fuel gauge was near red. He exhaled, looked down, and saw the convoy, still intact, the carriers untouched. He'd done his job. Again. Back aboard the escort carrier, Preston's landing was rough. His Wildcat skidded, bounced, then slammed down hard, snapping the tail hook. Deckhands ran in, waving him to cut the engine. When the propeller finally stopped spinning, Preston opened the canopy and just sat there, breathing. The smell of oil and burnt gunpowder filled the air. A young sailor jogged up, grinning. "Sir, you took down 2 more of those bastards. You're gonna make ace before you retire this crate." Preston laughed. "This crate's the reason I'm still around to count, kid." For many of these men, the FM-2 Wildcat wasn't just a machine, it was a partner. It had flaws, yes, slow, clumsy, underpowered, but it was predictable, tough, and honest. You could trust it. Even after the war ended, many pilots spoke fondly of their Wildcats. One Navy ace, when asked which aircraft he'd rather be shot at in, replied without hesitation. "The Wildcat. Every time. Because she'll bring you home even if you're flying on hope and fumes." When the war finally ended in August 1945, the Wildcat quietly disappeared from frontline service. The Hellcats and Corsairs took the victory parades, while the FM-2s were left to rust in tropical rain or sold as surplus. But among those who knew her, the carrier deck crews, the green pilots, the men of Taffy 3, she was remembered not as obsolete but as immortal. Because while others chased glory, the Wildcat did the dirty work. Holding the line, covering the retreat, guarding the helpless. And in doing so, she became one of the most respected and most underestimated heroes of the Pacific War. Years later, historian Barrett Tillman wrote, "The Wildcat didn't win the war by being beautiful. She won it by refusing to die." 1946, Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida. The war was over. The hangars smelled of oil and sea salt, and the runways were littered with the ghosts of the past. Rusting Corsairs, Hellcats, and a few weather-beaten FM-2 Wildcats sitting quietly at the edge of the tarmac. One of those old birds had a name scrawled on her side in fading white paint, Grim Kitten. She'd flown through Guadalcanal, the Marianas, and Leyte Gulf. Her wings bore the scars of shrapnel and flak, but she still looked proud, nose high, ready for one more sortie. A group of young flight cadets walked past, pointing and laughing. "Look at that old tin can," one said. "Can't believe they used to fight Zeros with that thing." An old instructor overheard them, Commander Dan Hayes, retired ace and veteran of the Philippine Sea. He stopped beside Grim Kitten, laid a hand on her dented fuselage and smiled. "Boys," he said, "that Tin Can shot down more Zeros than any plane you'll ever fly. They stared, unsure if he was serious. He was. Because history remembers the Wildcat not for its elegance, but for its endurance, its ability to keep flying when everything else broke. It wasn't built to dominate the skies, it was built to survive them. During the early years of the war, it faced impossible odds. The Zero outclimbed, outturned, and outgunned it. The Japanese aces had experience, agility, and a sense of invincibility. Yet, when the dust settled, it was the Wildcat's toughness and the pilot's discipline that turned the tide. Every plate of armor, every self-sealing fuel tank, every inch of reinforced airframe was designed not for speed, but for one simple purpose: to bring the pilot home. And it did. Statistically, the Wildcat had one of the highest survival rates of any frontline fighter of the war. Its pilots learned teamwork, precision, and restraint, the very qualities that became the backbone of modern U.S. naval aviation. The Thach weave, born from the Wildcat's limitations, evolved into the coordinated air combat tactics used to this day. The FM-2, the final version, was the culmination of all those lessons. Lighter, stronger, optimized for carrier operations. Even when faster planes arrived, the Navy kept it in service for one reason: nothing else could operate from the tiny decks of escort carriers and still get the job done. In the years after the war, the Wildcat became a training tool, then a museum piece, and finally a legend whispered about in flight circles. Pilots who had flown both Wildcats and later aircraft often said the same thing: if you could handle a Wildcat, you could handle anything. And perhaps that was its greatest legacy: it forged aviators. From John Thach's early experiments to the desperate defense at Leyte Gulf, the Wildcat represented more than metal and mechanics. It was a mindset: fight smart, endure, and never underestimate the underdog. Today, when historians speak of World War II's great aircraft, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Zero, the Wildcat rarely makes the headlines. But to the men who flew her, she was family. She wasn't the fastest or the prettiest, but she was always there, rugged, loyal, and dependable. She was the fighter that refused to die, the little plane that stood toe-to-toe with Japan's best and came home to tell the tale. As the sun set behind the old Pensacola hangars, Commander Hayes looked out over the field of silent aircraft and said softly, "They laughed at her once, but she kept us alive. That's what matters." The camera pans up, the sound of distant radial engines fades in, echoing across the decades. The final shot lingers on Grim Kitten, her nose pointing toward the open sky. The Wildcat. The fighter that never quit.